Washington, D.C. looked unreal to Daniel. After months of dust, smoke, and broken mountains, the city seemed almost theatrical. The plane landed at a private military terminal just outside the capital. Waiting on the tarmac was a sleek black government sedan and a driver already standing at attention. "Brigadier General Mercer," the driver said politely. Daniel nodded. Brick looked around. "Well, this is new." The car door opened for them. Inside the sedan, the leather seats were softer than anything Daniel had sat in since leaving home. The city rolled past the windows as they drove. Clean streets, tall monuments, glass towers of government and finance. Brick leaned back. "You know what this reminds me of?" "What?" "A different planet." Their hotel suite overlooked the Capitol dome. 2 bedrooms, a dining room, a sitting area bigger than the barracks Daniel's original company had lived in. On the table waited a black government card. "Unlimited authorization," the attendant explained, "for any amenities you require." Brick held the card like it might explode. "Unlimited?" The attendant smiled. "Within reason." After he left, Brick looked at Daniel. "Well, I guess we better be reasonable." They ordered food, expensive food, steaks, wine, dessert that cost more than a week of rations in the field. Daniel watched the city lights through the window. "This is excessive." Brick shrugged while examining the menu again. "Yeah." He looked around the room. "But we might as well enjoy it while we're here." They did. The next day, Daniel reported to the grand strategy meeting. The room was enormous, circular, screens covering entire walls, a massive illuminated world map spread across the center of the floor. Representatives from every branch of the government were present. Army generals, admirals, Air Force command, political advisors, corporate contractors, cabinet officials, even the president. Daniel quickly realized something else. He was the lowest ranking officer in the room. Brick stood quietly behind him along the wall. The discussions began. Global supply chains, resource corridors, corporate infrastructure, lobbyist pressure, regional trade agreements tied directly to military deployments. Entire continents were discussed like chessboards. Divisions, corps, naval strike groups, satellite networks. Not once did anyone mention the Auxiliary Brigade. Not once did anyone mention Valley Forge. Daniel watched the map carefully. The war looked completely different from this distance. It felt less like survival, more like accounting. After hours, the meeting finally ended. The officers and politicians filtered out. Daniel and Brick looked at each other. Brick whispered, "Why are we even here?" Daniel shook his head. "No idea." Before they could leave the building, 2 Secret Service agents approached them. "General Mercer?" "Yes?" "Please come with us." They were escorted outside to another vehicle. This one had no markings, no driver visible. The trip was short, but the destination was unmistakable. The White House. Brick stared at it. "Well, this is definitely a new planet." Inside, they passed through multiple layers of security. Doors, scanners, hallways guarded by silent agents. Eventually, they reached a final door. One agent opened it. "Please enter." Daniel stepped inside and froze. The Oval Office. He had seen it on television his entire life, but standing inside it felt surreal. Behind the desk stood the President of the United States, President Alexandra Vale. She was younger than Daniel expected, strikingly composed, sharp eyes, perfect posture. The room was filled with the highest officials in government: Vice President, National Security Council, Defense Secretary, Chief Advisors. President Vale smiled when Daniel and Brick entered. "General Mercer." Her voice was smooth. She stepped forward and studied them, both with open amusement. "You look exactly how I imagined." Daniel and Brick were visibly stunned. She laughed softly. She circled them slowly as she spoke. "You've been fighting a war in the mountains. and suddenly you're standing in the Oval Office. She leaned slightly closer. How surreal, right? Daniel said nothing. Brick looked like he had forgotten how to speak entirely. The president smiled. Let's talk about why you're really here. President Vale moved forward towards the desk. America has a morale problem. She spoke plainly. For decades, we've been fighting wars most Americans barely understand. She gestured towards Daniel. And then something unusual happens. A contract soldier wins a battle that changes the map. She tilted her head slightly. Rags to riches, the American dream, the fighting spirit. The advisors around the room watched quietly. President Vale leaned back against the desk. You've become something powerful. Daniel remained calm. Soldiers, ma'am? She smiled knowingly. No. You've become a story. She walked closer again. The Auxiliary Brigade has become America's sweetheart. Recruitment is up, patriotism is up, approval ratings are up. She spread her hands slightly. And none of that has anything to do with the actual war. Daniel understood immediately. President Vale spoke quietly now. The wars will continue. They always do. Resources, politics, industry, power. She looked directly at Daniel. But your next assignment is far more important than any battlefield. Brick shifted slightly. President Vale continued. You will represent the war. You will embody the American dream. You will inspire millions. She stepped back. And if you cooperate fully, every man in the Auxiliary Brigade survives. Daniel finally spoke. How? She smiled again. Because I control where you fight. A long silence followed. The room felt colder. President Vale gestured towards the door. You'll receive instructions. She gave them both one final look. Make me happy. Follow orders. And soon enough, you'll be rich, debt-free, and back home as heroes. Daniel and Brick left the office without another word. Outside in the hallway, Brick finally exhaled. Well, Daniel nodded slowly. The flight from Washington to Los Angeles felt unreal. Daniel sat quietly near the front of the military transport, while Brick slept with his head leaned back against the bulkhead, his mechanical arm resting across his chest. Neither of them spoke much. The meeting in the Oval Office hung in the air between them like a storm cloud. When the aircraft finally descended over Southern California, Daniel looked out the window. The Pacific stretched endlessly beyond the coastline. Sunlight glittered across the water. Below them, Los Angeles sprawled across the land like a glittering machine. Nothing about it looked like war. The transport landed at a sealed military airfield outside the city. Waiting there were dozens more aircraft and thousands of auxiliaries. The entire Auxiliary Brigade had been assembled. Contract soldiers from across the globe. Some fresh, some veterans, some still wearing scars from battles Daniel never seen. The moment Daniel stepped out the transport, the soldiers nearby snapped to attention. General Mercer! Salutes rippled across the crowd. Daniel returned them calmly. Brick leaned toward him. You know, they look at you like you're some kind of superhero. Daniel shook his head. Still, he moved through the assembled soldiers the same way he always had. He met them, one by one, asked their names, where they came from, what their story was. Men who had never expected to meet the general personally suddenly found themselves shaking his hand. The veterans especially thanked him, more than once. Sir, we thought we were all going to die out there. You made the brigade famous. You gave us a chance. Daniel accepted it quietly. Eventually, the entire brigade was escorted into a massive industrial structure near the edge of the city. The building was enormous, a warehouse large enough to hold aircraft. Inside it was filled with advanced projection systems, lighting rigs, motion cameras, drones, and massive digital screens. The entire interior could transform into any battlefield environment imaginable. Desert, mountain, urban war zones, jungle. It was a technological miracle, and it was filled with people Daniel had never expected to see. Hollywood, camera crews, makeup artists, lighting engineers, special effects teams, production assistants running everywhere. In the center of the chaos stood a man who immediately spotted Daniel. He rushed toward them. Tall, dressed in an immaculate designer suit, perfect hair, perfect posture, every movement theatrical. General Mercer! The man practically floated across the floor. I've been dying to meet you. He grabbed Daniel's hands with a dramatic enthusiasm. My name is Victor Laurent, director. He turned toward Brick. And you must be the legendary Sergeant Major. Brick blinked. Yeah. Victor circled them like a fashion designer inspecting models. Oh, this is perfect. He clapped his hands excitedly. The authenticity, the raw American masculinity, the scars. He turned back towards the production floor, where thousands of auxiliaries stood gathered. When he saw the brigade fully assembled, he literally gasped, Oh my God. Victor covered his mouth in delighted shock. This is magnificent. He spun around dramatically. Do you understand what this is? Daniel watched him carefully. Victor pointed towards the soldiers. Real heroes, real soldiers, real American grit. He clasped his hands together. This is cinematic gold. Brick leaned towards Daniel. I don't like this guy. Victor continued excitedly. We are going to tell your story. He gestured towards the enormous digital screens. The mountains, the battles, the heroics. We're recreating everything. Victor smiled brightly. For the American people. Daniel nodded slowly. Propaganda. Victor beamed. Oh, please. Let's call it patriotism. He spread his arms towards the brigade. You gentlemen are about to become the most famous soldiers in the country. Victor leaned closer. Your victories, your sacrifices, your legend will show it all. He clapped again, and the public will fall in love. Daniel glanced across the brigade. Thousands of auxiliaries waiting, watching. Victor's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. You already knew this was coming, didn't you? Daniel didn't answer. Victor straightened his suit jacket. Excellent, he grinned, because we start filming tomorrow. Brick muttered under his breath. Jesus. Victor looked thrilled. This is going to be beautiful. Filming began the next morning, and it never really stopped. From sunrise to sunset, the Auxiliary Brigade lived inside the enormous warehouse complex outside Los Angeles. The interior of the building could transform into almost anything. Digital projection walls surrounded the massive floor. Mountains, cities, jungles, deserts. The entire battlefield is recreated in stunning detail. The brigade was split into units, each company assigned to different scenes. Some days they played American troops. Other days they played the enemy. Sometimes they played both in the same day. Every battle had to look real. Explosions, gunfire, blood packs, combat choreography. The director insisted on absolute authenticity. No, 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 no! Victor Laurent screamed across the set one morning. That charge was emotionally hollow. He waved both arms dramatically. You are warriors of destiny, not bored mall security. Hundreds of exhausted auxiliaries stood in formation under the blazing lights. Victor stomped across the floor. Again! Brick leaned towards Daniel. This guy is worse than Loftus. Daniel nodded quietly. The drill instructors had been brutal. Victor was something else entirely. He was tireless, endlessly energetic, flamboyant, dramatic, perfection obsessed. He demanded dozens of takes for the smallest moments, charging scenes repeated again and again, dialogue delivered repeatedly from different angles, cameras rolling from drones, shoulder rigs, cranes, actors screaming battle cries until their voices cracked. Blood effects sprayed. Men fell again and again for the cameras. Each day ended only when every single person on set was physically exhausted. Victor would finally clap his hands and declare dramatically, "All right, my beautiful soldiers, we rest." The brigade collapsed every night. The government had spared no expense on their accommodations. Luxury housing, excellent food, comfortable beds, endless amenities. But none of it mattered. They were too tired to enjoy any of it. The men simply ate, showered, and slept. They woke up to do it all again. Brick sat one evening watching a giant screen in the common area. The footage played across the streaming platforms, social media, news networks. The scenes looked incredible, heroic, epic, glorious. American soldiers charging through impossible battles, auxiliaries holding mountains against impossible odds. Daniel Mercer leading the charge. Brick shook his head. "Well," he gestured towards the screen, "that's not exactly how it happened." Daniel watched quietly. The real battles had been dirtier, scarier, more chaotic. The films were clean, heroic, inspiring, and the country loved it. Recruitment surged. The Auxiliary Brigade had become a phenomenon. The news talked about them constantly. Stories of redemption, stories of debtors becoming heroes, stories of the American dream reborn through courage and sacrifice. Across the country, people were signing contracts, record numbers. Debtors, the poor, people who had nowhere else to go. The meat grinder kept growing. Daniel watched the footage silently. Months passed. The filming continued. Every day felt the same. The war was happening somewhere far away now. But here, they were recreating it endlessly. Daniel stood outside the barracks one night, staring at the city lights. Brick joined him. "You're thinking too much." Daniel didn't look at him. "We're lying." Brick shrugged. "Yeah." Daniel glanced at him. "That doesn't bother you?" Brick leaned against the railing. "The world's always been like this." Daniel stayed quiet. Brick continued. "Those guys signing contracts?" He shrugged again. "They were already screwed. Dead slaves, dead-end lives. At least this way they get a shot." Daniel sighed. Brick nudged him. "And look at it this way." "What?" "We're probably working harder now as actors than we did in the war." Daniel laughed softly. That part was true. Victor Laurent had somehow created the most exhausting training environment Daniel had ever experienced. Brick grinned. "I swear that guy is worse than any drill instructor." Daniel smiled. Victor would run combat operations just to get better lighting. They stood quietly for a moment. There was no more mail call now. Total secrecy. Nothing about what they were doing could leak. Daniel thought about his family, about the messages he had deleted, about the men who were now joining the war because of what they were filming. The moral weight sat heavy on him. Brick looked over. "You're keeping these guys alive." He gestured towards the barracks behind him. "Thousands of auxiliaries sitting here, safe." Daniel nodded slowly. "And eventually," Brick smiled, "we all get paid." Daniel stared out across Los Angeles. A war hero, a general, an actor, and somewhere far away, the real war continued. Years passed inside the warehouse. At first the filming had felt strange, artificial, but over time the Auxiliary Brigade adapted the way soldiers always did. They became professionals at it. Veterans of a different kind of battlefield. The choreography sharpened. The timing improved. By the third year, the brigade could execute massive battle sequences almost perfectly on the first take. Hundreds of men charging across simulated terrain, explosions detonating exactly where they should, weapons firing in perfect rhythm, camera drones gliding overhead. Victor Laurent watched from behind the monitors like a conductor guiding a symphony. Magnificent, he whispered often, and the world watched. The film spread across every platform imaginable. Streaming services, social networks, national broadcasts. Schools even used the footage for patriotic presentations. The Auxiliary Brigade had become legendary, faces recognizable across the country. The story of the debtor soldiers who rose to glory had become one of the most powerful myths in modern America. Recruitment never slowed. The war machine remained fed. Eventually, the contracts began approaching their final months. Daniel could feel the change in the brigade. Many of the soldiers had arrived young. Now they were older, experienced, wiser, and strangely restless. One evening, Daniel was summoned to Victor's office. The director greeted him with a radiant smile. "General Mercer." Victor swept across the room dramatically. "My dear, dear Daniel." He clasped his hands together with a genuine excitement. "You have given me the greatest artistic experience of my life." Daniel stood quietly. Victor continued. "You and your men are the finest performers I've ever worked with." He paced across the room energetically. "The authenticity, the humanity, the epic scale." He turned suddenly. "We have created the greatest cinematic masterpiece mankind has ever seen." Daniel didn't argue. Victor wasn't entirely wrong. The films had changed culture. Victor's expression softened. "But now," he sighed dramatically, "it is time." Daniel tilted his head slightly. Victor stepped closer. "You must return to the real battlefield." Daniel remained silent. Victor lifted one hand toward the massive screens behind him. "We have recreated every battle, every hero, every sacrifice. But the truth is," he smiled sadly, "you are the real characters, the real warriors." Victor's eyes sparkled with emotion. "The world is a stage, and every one of us is an actor." He placed his hand gently on Daniel's shoulder. "But your story cannot end inside a studio." Daniel finally spoke. "You want us to go back to war?" Victor nodded slowly. "The ultimate masterpiece, the final act." Daniel studied him carefully. Victor raised a finger quickly. "Of course, if you prefer to finish your contract safely here," he gestured broadly, "I can absolutely arrange that. You and your brigade can complete their final month's filming. No risk, no blood, no death." Victor smiled warmly. "Whatever you choose." Daniel nodded slowly. "I'll speak with the brigade." Victor beamed. "I knew you would." That night, Daniel gathered the entire brigade. Thousands of auxiliaries filled the warehouse floor. Men who had once been strangers, now veterans, actors, warriors. Daniel told them everything Victor had said. The choice: finish safely or return to the war. The room fell silent for several seconds. Then someone shouted from the crowd, "One more fight!" Another voice joined, "One last battle!" More voices followed. Soon the entire brigade was roaring. They didn't want the safe ending. They wanted the real one, the final proof of what they were. Warriors, where metal met meat, where stories ended honestly. Brick stepped beside Daniel. "Told you they'd say that." Daniel nodded quietly. The chant began spreading through the entire brigade. "Mercer! Mercer! Mercer!" They raised their fists in the air, calling for their general, calling for war. High above them, standing quietly behind the observation glass, Victor Laurent watched the scene unfold. Tears streamed down his face. He pressed both hands against the glass. "Perfection," he whispered. "The final act." For Victor, this moment was more beautiful than anything they had filmed, because this was real, and the world would never forget the story of the Auxiliary Brigade's last battle. The flight to Washington felt routine now. Daniel and Brick had done this before. The private transport, the silent escorts, the government cars waiting on the runway. Everything moved with the quiet efficiency of power. This time neither of them stared out the windows. Neither of them commented on the luxury. They chauffeured ride through Washington, the marble halls, the silent Secret Service agents. They moved through it all calmly. Years had changed them. The doors opened. The Oval Office looked exactly the same. President Alexandra Vale stood behind her desk, radiant with energy. Election victory banners and fresh news reports flickered on the screens behind her. Her staff surrounded the room like devoted satellites, advisors, strategists, political loyalists. When she saw Daniel and Brick enter, her smile widened instantly. "My heroes!" She rushed towards them. Before either man could react, she wrapped her arms around Daniel and pulled him close. The kiss she gave him was bold and commanding. Then she did the same to Brick. Brick blinked after, like someone who had just been hit with a flashbang. The president laughed brightly. She stepped back and climbed onto the edge of her desk, sitting in a relaxed but powerful pose. The room belonged entirely to her. She looked energized, victorious. "I just won re-election." Her staff nodded approvingly behind her. "And you two helped make that happen." She leaned forward. "I love the way this has all unfolded." Daniel stood quietly. Brick crossed his arms. They listened. President Vale clasped her hands together. "Your final battle." She smiled slowly. "I found the perfect stage." She tapped the tablet beside her. A map appeared on the screen. The city was unmistakable. Jerusalem. She watched their faces carefully. 33 degrees north? She waited. Neither Daniel nor Brick reacted. The president blinked once. "Really?" She shrugged. "Fine. No conspiracy theorists in the room." Her tone turned practical again. "Jerusalem cannot be destroyed. Too many religions, too many sacred sites, too many political complications." She gestured to the map. "This city has to be taken the old way, street by street, door by door." She smiled brightly again. "And who better than the Auxiliary Brigade?" Her excitement built as she spoke. "The famous General Mercer leading the charge. Live coverage, streaming worldwide." She spread her arms dramatically. "Imagine it, if you win." Her eyes sparkled. "It will be the most glorious victory in modern history." She leaned forward. "And if you die?" A small smile touched her lips. "You become a martyr." She laughed softly, unable to contain the thrill. "America will break its heart for you." Her joy filled the room. "This is magnificent." Her advisors nodded eagerly. She slid off the desk. Then something unexpected happened. The president raised one hand. The room slowly cleared. Her staff stepped outside. For a moment, it was just the three of them. President Vale walked closer to Daniel. Her voice softened. "I know something about you." Daniel waited. "My people tell me you haven't contacted your family in years." Brick glanced sideways at him. The president continued. "They're doing well. Your wife is still loyal. Your children are growing. They're thriving." She smiled gently. "With the money you earned them." Daniel said nothing. She placed a hand lightly on his arm. They love you. Her tone was sincere. You're a good man, Daniel Mercer. For once there was no performance, no politics, just a simple observation. She stepped back. You did exactly what a real American man is supposed to do. Take care of his family. Her eyes held his for a moment. Live or die, you've done your duty. The silence lingered. Then the moment passed. President Vale straightened and returned to her confident posture. Good luck in Jerusalem. Daniel and Brick turned to leave. As the doors closed behind them, Brick finally exhaled. Well, Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah. Outside the White House, the war waited for its final act. The aircraft carrying Daniel and Brick landed outside Acre just before dawn. The Mediterranean air carried salt and warmth, so different from the mountains where their legend had begun. Waiting beyond the runway were thousands of men, the Auxiliary Brigade. Every surviving veteran, every fresh contract soldier, every man who had joined after the films made them famous. They were already preparing, weapons being cleaned, armor adjusted, equipment checked. When Daniel stepped off the transport, the men began gathering, almost instinctively. Soon the massive barracks had filled, thousands of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for their general, waiting for Dad. Daniel stepped forward slowly. For a moment, he just looked at them. He recognized so many faces. Ramirez. Lucky Ramirez grinned and raised a hand. Whitaker. Feldman. More voices answered. Names from Company Bravo, names from the battalion battles, names from the years spent acting together. Men he had spoken with late at night in barracks halls. Men who had trusted him through every stage, strange turn their lives had taken. Daniel shook his head slightly. You know, he paused. This whole journey has been strange. Some laughter moved through the crowd. We started as soldiers, then we became actors. He shrugged slightly. And now we're soldiers again. The men listened quietly. Daniel continued. I've spent a lot of time thinking about right and wrong, about what any of this means. He looked around the hall. The truth is, I don't think anyone really knows. A few men nodded. The world's a stage, and every one of us is playing a role. Daniel smiled faintly. But there is one thing that's real. He tapped his chest. Freedom. For you, for your families, for the people waiting for you at home. That's something worth fighting for. He paused. I love you, men. The room grew completely silent. It's been the greatest honor of my life, walking this road with you. He gestured across the massive crowd. You came here for different reasons. Debt, desperation, a chance at something better. But no matter how you got here, we've done something extraordinary. He shrugged lightly. If there is such a thing as glory, I think we found it. A few smiles appeared. And tomorrow, we finish the story. Daniel's voice grew firmer. Fight hard, fight smart, and fight to survive. The brigade erupted. Cheers, shouting, men pounding fists against armor. Brick leaned towards him and whispered, Hell of a speech. The next morning felt surreal. Thousands of auxiliaries stood ready outside the city. Each soldier carried his preferred weapons, rifles, machine guns, shotguns, grenades. Some wore heavy armor, others moved light and fast, every man a hero in his own mind. Daniel carried what he always had, the light machine gun, extra belts of ammunition. Brick stood behind him, combat shotgun with drum magazines. Lucky Ramirez joined them. Just like old times, Ramirez said. Daniel nodded. The convoy trucks rolled toward the city. Helmet displays lit up. The familiar AI voice returned. Auxiliary Brigade, welcome back to the front. A tactical map appeared across their visors. Enemy positions marked throughout the city. Drone coverage sweeping overhead. Then another voice cut across the comms. Bright, playful. President Vale. My heroes! Cheers erupted inside the trucks. You are about to make history. Her voice carried excitement. Clear every room, every street, every corner. I salute you, and your country salutes you. Brick glanced at Daniel. They both blushed slightly, remembering their meeting in the Oval Office. The truck stopped outside Jerusalem. The auxiliaries dismounted quickly, forming attack lines. The city stood before them. Ancient stone, narrow streets, centuries of history waiting inside. Daniel stepped to the front. One last time. Thousands of soldiers watched him. I'll get you all home. He raised the machine gun. Dead or alive. Then he ran forward. The brigade followed. Daniel's plan was simple. Thousands of soldiers divided into three-man fire teams. Small, fast, independent. Years of filming together had created natural partnerships. Men already knew how each other moved, how they cleared rooms, how they covered corners. It was choreography, but now the explosions and gunfire were real. The brigade flooded the city. Fire teams breaking off, clearing buildings, moving street by street. Daniel moved through the streets with Brick and Lucky Ramirez, the same trio that had fought together since the early days. Door, kick, flash, gunfire. Enemy fighters appeared in stairwells, behind barricades, inside apartments. Daniel's machine gun roared. Brick's shotgun thundered. Ramirez moved quickly between them with rifle fire. Drones buzzed overhead, recording everything. Streams broadcast across the world. Some drones drifted too close to the gunfire. Brick blasted one out of the sky. Get that camera out of my face. Daniel laughed briefly before kicking another door open. Years of rehearsal showed. The auxiliaries moved with frightening precision. Room clearing drills they had practiced thousands of times during filming now unfolded perfectly in real combat. Door, entry, crossfire, advance. Every movement efficient, every angle covered. The fighting was brutal, close. Enemies appeared just feet away. Gunshots so close smoke curled from wounds. But their brigade kept advancing, house by house, street by street. Across the world, millions watched. Victor Laurent sat in his Los Angeles studio, tears streaming down his cheeks. It's perfect, he whispered. The final masterpiece. President Vale watched from Washington, her fingers pressed against her lips as Daniel appeared on one of the live feeds clearing another building. In the training depot thousands of miles away, the old colonel who had first welcomed the auxiliaries watched quietly. He smiled. In the Valley Forge Command Center, the general stood at attention before the broadcast, saluting the screen. By evening, the fighting had ended. Jerusalem fell silent. The Auxiliary Brigade controlled the city. Daniel climbed the steps of the Dome of the Rock, his uniform covered in dust and blood. Brick and Ramirez behind him. Thousands of auxiliaries gathered across the plaza. Daniel raised the captured enemy flag high above the city. The drones raised circled overhead, recording every angle, every moment. Across the world, people watched the final image. The legendary General Mercer, standing above the city with his brigade behind him. The last scene of the war's most famous soldiers. The final act of the Auxiliary Brigade. 4 years had passed since Daniel Mercer walked out of that house before dawn. The neighborhood looked almost exactly the same. Copper Ridge Estates, quiet streets, soft yellow porch lights, children's bicycles leaning against fences. The Mercer house sat where it always had. But it looked different now. The yard was healthy, the fence repaired, the home itself beautifully remodeled, fresh paint, new windows, a garden along the front walkway. Inside the house, warm light glowed through the curtains. A government transport settled silently on the street before lifting its doors. Daniel stepped out alone. No ceremony, no reporters, no cameras, just a man stepping onto the pavement. The aircraft lifted off and disappeared quietly into the night sky. Daniel stood there for a long time. The street was calm. Crickets chirped somewhere beyond the houses. He looked up at the home, his home. The place he had left everything still felt impossible. Now the debts were gone, the contracts completed. Enough money existed to ensure his family would never struggle again. His wife no longer worked exhausting shifts at the hospital. She had pursued the dreams she had once postponed. Painting, gardening, travel. Their children were older now, 4 years older, growing up inside the same house where he had left them. The lights were on. Daniel could see movement through the window. A silhouette passed through the living room. For a moment, he couldn't move. Tears began streaming down his face. Not dramatic, not loud. Just silent tears sliding down weathered cheeks. He made no sound, no expression. Just stood there in the quiet street. Years of war, years of acting, years of carrying the weight of thousands of men. All of it ended here. The tears slowed. Eventually they stopped. His face dried in the cool night air. Daniel took one breath, then another. Finally he walked forward, up the path, toward the door. A car passed slowly down the street. The driver glanced casually toward the house. For a moment, he thought he saw something unusual. A man standing in the doorway, a woman rushing forward, children colliding into his arms, all of them wrapped together in a tight embrace. The man looked strangely familiar. The driver squinted slightly. Was that? No, impossible. The famous General Mercer would never just appear in a quiet neighborhood like this. The driver shook his head and continued down the street. Inside the Mercer home, Daniel held his family, and for the first time in many years, the war was finally over. The end.